Somewhere in the Pacific, a population's genome is missing something it should have, not a small gap, a consistent one, measured across more than 1,000 individuals, the same way every time. Every neighboring island chain that shares this group's migration history carries a heavier dose of a particular ancestral signature. This group carries less, far less. Not because the data is incomplete, because the data is exact. Geography says the numbers should match. The route was the same. The timeline was the same. The culture, the language family, the canoes, the crops, all shared. And yet one island chain's blood tells a different story than its neighbors, as if it took a different road to reach the same destination. For decades, nobody thought to check closely enough. Estimates were rough, sample sizes were small, and the assumption held simply because nobody had gathered enough genomes to challenge it. When someone finally did, the discrepancy didn't shrink. It held. For decades, the story of how this part of the Pacific was settled has been told the same way, and for good reason. It's a remarkable one. Roughly 3,000 years ago, a seafaring culture archaeologists call Lapita pushed east out of Taiwan and the islands of Southeast Asia, carrying pottery stamped with fine dentate patterns, pigs, chickens, taro, and breadfruit in double-hulled canoes built for ocean crossings most of the ancient world never attempted. They moved through near Oceania, past the Bismarck Archipelago, past the Solomon Islands, and pushed further than anyone before them into open water, into what researchers now call remote Oceania. The language survived the crossing. The crops survived the crossing. The pottery style survived the crossing. By the time this culture reached Tonga, and then the islands at the heart of this story, it had carried a single founding population across thousands of miles of ocean, mixing along the way with the Papuan ancestry peoples who had already lived near New Guinea for tens of thousands of years, what geneticists call admixture, the blending of two previously separate populations into one shared bloodline, the way two rivers merge into a single current downstream. The standard model has long assumed that mixture happened roughly evenly, one wave, one general blending, a shared inheritance distributed in roughly the same proportions wherever the Lapita descendants settled. Tonga, Fiji, the islands now home to millions of Polynesian descendants worldwide. It is a clean story. It is a well-supported one. Linguists can trace it through the Austronesian language family, which stretches today from Madagascar to Easter Island, one of the widest spread language families on Earth. Archaeologists can trace it through pottery shards, fish hooks, and obsidian trade routes left in the soil across hundreds of islands. But when geneticists finally had enough complete genomes from this one population to test the assumption directly, not estimate it, not infer it from a handful of samples, but actually test it, the numbers didn't behave the way 50 years of theory said they should. Here's where it gets complicated. In 2020, a team of geneticists published the most detailed genetic portrait of this population ever assembled. More than 1,100 complete genomes sequenced through a National Precision Medicine Genome Program, with population geneticist Ethan Cochrane of the University of Auckland among the contributing researchers. Published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the study set out to confirm what everyone already assumed, that this group's Papuan ancestry would sit in the same range as its neighbors. It didn't. The average came out to just over 24% Papuan-related ancestry. Neighboring Polynesian groups, Tongans, and several smaller Polynesian outlier populations scattered toward the Solomon Islands averaged closer to 35%. That's not a marginal difference. That's roughly a third less of an ancestral signal that, by every account of shared history, should have arrived in something closer to the same dose. And the gap wasn't scattered or inconsistent from person to person. It was tight, uniform, repeated across nearly 1,200 separate genomes with barely any variation, the genetic equivalent of measuring the same missing ingredient in nearly 1,200 separate kitchens and getting almost the same number every time. Then there was a second layer to the anomaly, one almost nobody expected. Buried in the same genomes was a trace of DNA inherited from the Denisovans, an extinct branch of archaic humans, cousins of the Neanderthals, who interbred with the ancestors of people across Asia and the Pacific tens of thousands of years ago. Think of it as a genetic fossil, not a story passed down in words, but a literal fragment of an extinct relative's body, preserved inside a living one. And when researchers traced where that Denisovan fragment came from, it tracked precisely with the same Papuan ancestry that was already running thin, not with Neanderthal ancestry, which followed its own separate, unrelated pattern entirely. Two different ancient relatives, two different inheritance trails, and only one of them showed up faint. So the question sharpened, and it refused to go away quietly. Why would the one population sitting closest to the geographic and cultural center of this migration end up with the faintest trace of the very ancestry that, in theory, should have reached it first and strongest? The first theory is the most straightforward, and it comes from some of the clearest ancient DNA ever recovered from the region. In 2016, a team led by population geneticist Pontus Skoglund, working out of Harvard, sequenced genome-wide data directly from skeletons found at two of the oldest known Lapita sites in the Pacific, one on the island of Efate in Vanuatu, dated to roughly 3,000 years ago, and another in Tonga, dated only slightly later. Both individuals turned out to be almost entirely East Asian in ancestry, closely related to the indigenous peoples of Taiwan today, with little to no Papuan ancestry at all. That finding reframed the whole timeline. It meant the first wave of settlers crossing into the remote Pacific carried almost no Papuan ancestry with them. The Papuan signal everyone now sees across Polynesia arrived later, in a second, distinct wave, dated to somewhere between 1,200 and 2,000 years ago. And it appears to have been sex-biased, carried disproportionately by Papuan men marrying into communities already descended from the original Lapita voyagers. Other research across the wider region backs this up in an unexpected way. Across Polynesian populations broadly, Papuan ancestry shows up far more strongly in the Y chromosome. The marker passed down only from father to son, generation after generation, like a name that travels exclusively through the men in a family and never the women, than it does in mitochondrial DNA, which travels only through mothers, like a separate parallel thread running down the maternal line. In some estimates, Papuan ancestry sits near 2/3 in that paternal thread, but only a small fraction in the maternal one. Two different lines of inheritance, two different stories, one shaped heavily by Papuan men joining these communities, the other shaped far less so. It's an elegant explanation, supported by some of the most direct physical evidence available. Actual ancient bone, not just modern inference. It accounts for why Papuan ancestry exists in this part of the Pacific at all, and why it seems to have traveled along one parent's line far more than the others. What it doesn't explain is why one population would receive noticeably less of that second wave than its closest neighbor, when both sat along what was, broadly, the same migration corridor, exposed to the same secondary contact at roughly the same time. The model explains the presence of the signal. It does not explain the imbalance. This is the part the records don't explain. The second theory is more complicated and more contested among researchers who study this region. Instead of one shared secondary wave reaching every island in roughly equal measure, this theory proposes that the population at the center of this mystery may have been founded by a genuinely distinct group, one with a different ancestry mix from the start than the group that settled its nearest neighbor. Not one wave splitting evenly, multiple separate colonizing pulses, each carrying its own slightly different genetic signature. There's supporting evidence from elsewhere in the Pacific. A 2018 genome-wide study of islands further east identified a secondary admixture event, distinct from the original founding population, dated to somewhere between 1,700 and 1,200 years ago, traceable through a specific Y chromosome lineage. A Y chromosome lineage is simply a marker passed down father to son, unbroken, generation after generation, like a name inherited only through the male line, never altered along the way. Finding a distinct one tied to a separate time frame suggests Papuan ancestry didn't arrive in the Pacific as a single clean event. It arrived in at least two genetically distinguishable episodes, possibly more, each leaving its own slightly different fingerprint behind on different islands. If that's true here, it would mean this population's lower Papuan ancestry isn't really a deficit at all. It's a different inheritance entirely, the result of a founding group that simply never received or received much less of whichever secondary wave reached its neighbors. Researchers are careful to frame this as probability, not certainty. The honest limitation is that direct ancient DNA recovered from the population at the heart of this story remains sparse. Most of what's known about its deep ancestry comes from modern genomes, reasoned backward, not skeletons pulled directly from its own soil. Until that changes, this theory stays a strong possibility, not a settled fact. And here the story stops being simple. The third theory, and the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud, goes a layer deeper than Papuan ancestry altogether. It starts with a strange inconsistency in the Denisovan numbers themselves. Some studies estimate that Melanesian populations carry between 3 and 6% Denisovan ancestry. Others, using different statistical methods, calculate closer to 1%. That's not a rounding error. That's a gap large enough that some researchers have proposed it can't be explained by Neanderthals and Denisovans alone. That a third, still unidentified archaic human lineage, distinct from both, may have contributed DNA to the Papuan ancestors who eventually passed a portion of that mixture forward into this story's population. Think of it less as one extinct relative leaving a single fingerprint, and more as multiple overlapping handprints pressed into the same page, some so faint they're easy to mistake for one. The data doesn't confirm this. It only fails to rule it out. Most researchers stop short of calling it settled. The statistical methods themselves are still being argued over, and an unidentified archaic population is, by definition, difficult to prove from absence alone. But the discrepancy in the numbers hasn't gone away, and nobody has fully explained it yet. Imagine standing on a beach of dark, volcanic sand, somewhere on the northern coast of one of these islands, nearly 2,800 years ago. The air is heavy and warm, thick with salt and the green smell of crushed coral underfoot. A double-hulled canoe rides low in the shallows, weighed down with breadfruit saplings, taro shoots, a few pigs pacing nervously in woven pens, and stacks of pottery stamped with fine repeating dentate patterns pressed into wet clay before it ever left the kiln. There is no welcome waiting on the shore. No settlement yet, just open ground, birdsong, and the people stepping off the canoe. Not an army, not an empire, perhaps only a few dozen people, maybe fewer, speaking a language that would, over the centuries, become ancestral to the one spoken in this same place today. Somewhere further inland, mountains rise sharply out of dense, unbroken forest. There is no way to know yet whether anyone else already lives nearby, whether the next canoe will follow this one, or whether this small group will be remembered at all. Nobody steps off that canoe imagining a genome. Nobody is thinking about Papuan ancestry, or Denisovan fragments, or percentages that researchers will argue over 28 centuries later. They are thinking about water, about whether the next island will be inhabited, about whether the pigs will survive the next leg of the journey. But every choice made on that beach, who stayed, who left again, who they met, who they didn't, is still sitting inside the genome of everyone descended from them. The data says these particular ancestors carried almost no Papuan ancestry at all. For now, that's the only certainty anyone has, and this is where the irony sets in. That same 2020 study that found the missing Papuan ancestry also found something else. Evidence that this population went through an extreme genetic bottleneck, staying small and staying remarkably uniform for centuries after that first canoe landed. Then, around 1,000 years ago, the numbers shift. A sudden, sharp population expansion lining up almost exactly with archaeological evidence of new, more intensive agriculture, and the rise of large mound structures historians now connect to the origins of a formal chiefly system. The same archaeological record shows almost no major landscape change for well over 1,000 years after first settlement. And then, abruptly, everything changes at once. So the thinness everyone found so strange wasn't isolation in the sense of being cut off. It was survival. A small founding population, narrowed almost to the edge of disappearing, that held on. Then grew again. They held the language, survived. They held the rituals, survived. They held the bloodline, survived. And the second irony sits right alongside the first. Despite carrying the thinnest trace of Papuan ancestry anywhere in the region, this population still carries that Denisovan fragment, proof that even a minor, almost erased contact event, centuries before the bottleneck even began, left a mark the bottleneck never managed to erase, not by years, by centuries. The population that looks, on paper, the least mixed in the entire region is, underneath, a population built on near disappearance, carrying forward only a fraction of what its neighbors received, and somehow still holding on to every piece of it that mattered. One elder from the islands, reflecting on this kind of research when it's explained to her, is said to have put it more simply than any geneticist could. We did not vanish, we narrowed, and what survived the narrowing is still us. Zoom out far enough, and this isn't really a story about one population in the Pacific. It's a story about what genetic purity actually means, which is almost never what people assume. Every population that looks untouched or isolated in a genome is really just a population whose particular accident of timing, which contact events happened, which didn't, which bottleneck nearly wiped them out, and which one they survived, left a different set of marks than its neighbors. Not none. Different. The same will likely be true of dozens of other populations whose genomes haven't been sequenced this closely yet. The third theory, about the still unidentified archaic lineage, remains unresolved. The question of whether this population descended from one founding wave or several also remains unresolved. Neither is likely to close soon, and researchers studying this region seem, if anything, more cautious about declaring it solved than they were 5 years ago. A genome, in the end, isn't so different from a page that's been written on, scraped clean and written on again. Most of what came before erased, but never completely. A handprint pressed faintly underneath the newer ink, waiting for someone with the right tools to notice it's there. Scientists may have finally traced where the Samoans really came from, but what the DNA results actually shocked everyone with wasn't an answer. It was how much of the page is still unread.